The moment Sallie Doyle stepped onto the main boardwalk of Crestfall, Texas in the spring of 1878, not a single man in town turned his head to look at her, and that was a fact she had grown so accustomed to that she had nearly stopped noticing it herself. She was 23 years old, and she had lived in Crestfall her entire life. She had grown up in the same house on the eastern edge of town where her father, a retired railroad surveyor named Thomas Doyle, had planted a modest vegetable garden that Sallie tended every season with quiet devotion. She had attended the same small church every Sunday since she was a girl. She had bought her flour and her salt and her calico fabric from the same general store for as long as she could remember, and every single morning she delivered eggs from her dozen hens to Hattie Monroe's boarding house at the north end of the main street, and every single morning she did these things without any particular fuss, because that was simply who Sallie Doyle was. She was not homely. She was not awkward. She was not unkind or strange or difficult to speak with. She had warm brown eyes that caught the light in a particular way when she laughed, and her dark hair was always pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet that had seen 3 seasons of sun and dust. She was thoughtful and practical and funny in a quiet, dry sort of way that most people missed entirely because they were not paying close enough attention. She read everything she could lay her hands on, from dime novels to the agricultural almanac, to the occasional copy of Harper's Weekly that arrived at the general store weeks behind schedule. She had opinions about cattle grazing and water rights and the politics of Reconstruction, and she could recite poetry from memory when the evening was long and the air was still. But the men of Crestfall simply did not see her. There was Harold Fitch, who owned the livery stable and spent most of his spare time courting the Miller daughters. There was Deputy Warren Good, who was sweet on Reverend Albright's niece and made absolutely no secret of it. There was old Clyde Birch, who was 67 years old and a widower, and who looked through Sallie every time she came into his general store as though she were a window rather than a person. There was a whole population of men between the ages of 20 and 40 in Crestfall who had, by some collective and apparently unconscious agreement, simply decided that Sallie Doyle was not the sort of woman one noticed in that particular way. Her closest friend was a woman named Ruth Carver, who was 26 and married to a cattle rancher named Pete Carver and who had 2 small sons and a personality as bright and pointed as a new pin. Ruth noticed everything. Ruth said once, sitting on Sallie's front porch in the blue light of a September evening the year before, "Sallie, I do not understand it. I truly do not. You are the most interesting woman in this entire county, and every man in town walks past you like you are a fence post." Sallie had laughed and said, "Maybe I am a fence post. I am certainly sturdy enough." Ruth had not laughed. She had looked at Sallie with an expression of genuine and tender frustration and said, "Do not make a joke of it. You deserve someone who sees you." Sallie had thanked her and meant it, and then she had walked home in the warm September dark and fed her hens and read 3 chapters of a novel by the light of an oil lamp and told herself that she was perfectly content. And mostly she was. She had made her peace with the shape of her life. She had a home and a garden and her books and her friendship with Ruth and the reliable rhythm of her daily work, and she told herself that these things were enough, and she almost always believed it. The trouble was the almost. The spring of 1878 brought 3 things to Crestfall in quick succession. It brought a late frost that killed half of Sallie's seedlings and required her to start her vegetable garden over from scratch, which was infuriating but manageable. It brought a new schoolteacher from San Antonio named Miss Clara Pratt, who was pretty and cheerful and immediately became the object of several men's enthusiastic attention, which Sallie observed with a mild and not entirely unembarrassed pang of something she refused to call envy. And it brought Gilbert Fletcher. He rode into Crestfall on a Thursday afternoon at the very end of March, when the sky was the clear, piercing blue of early spring, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were just beginning to show their pale green edges. He was riding a big roan horse with a white blaze on its face, and he had a bedroll tied behind the saddle and a rifle in the scabbard, and the look of a man who had been traveling for a considerable time. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where it had grown a little too long, and a jaw that was shadowed with 3 or 4 days of growth, and eyes that were an unusual shade somewhere between gray and green, the color of sage in the rain. He was lean and long-limbed, and he sat his horse with the easy, unconscious grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He came to Crestfall because he had been hired by a rancher named Edward Prentice to serve as trail boss for a cattle drive north toward Abilene that was planned for June. Edward Prentice was 60 years old and had one of the larger cattle operations in the county, about 3,000 head grazing on a spread 12 miles southeast of town, and he needed a man with experience and a reliable reputation to manage the drive. Gilbert Fletcher came with both. He had bossed 3 drives up the Kisham Trail in the previous 4 years, and his name was known well enough among the cattle community of Central Texas that Prentice had written to him in January and offered him the position, and Gilbert had accepted. He arrived in town, stabled his horse with Harold Fitch at the livery, took a room at Hattie Monroe's boarding house, ate a late supper at the small restaurant attached to the boarding house, and went to bed without speaking to more than 6 people, which was exactly as many people as the business of arriving required. Sallie did not meet him that first day. She was at home, replanting her frost-killed seedlings in the cold frame her father had built years ago along the south wall of the house, working in the late afternoon light with her hands in the dirt and her mind on the almanac's prediction for the coming week. And she did not know that the man who would change everything had ridden into town while she was kneeling in her garden. She met him the following morning. She was doing what she did every morning, which was collecting her basket of eggs from the henhouse, wrapping each one carefully in a square of cloth, and walking the 4 blocks north to Hattie Monroe's boarding house to make her delivery. It was early, barely past 7 o'clock, and the spring air still had that clean cold edge that would burn off within an hour once the sun got properly established. She was thinking about whether she had enough saved to buy a new length of muslin, and whether the almanac was right about the rain, and she came around the corner of the boarding house to the back kitchen door just as Gilbert Fletcher came around the corner from the front, apparently also headed for the kitchen, presumably in search of breakfast. They nearly collided. She caught herself and took a step back and said, "Excuse me," automatically, and he did the same, and for a moment they both stood there in the narrow strip of shade beside the building, each holding their respective item, she with her basket of eggs and he with his hat in his hands because he had been running his fingers through his hair as he walked. He was taller than she had expected, or perhaps she had not expected anything at all, since she had not known he existed until that moment. "No, excuse me," he said, and then he looked at her. He did not look through her. He looked directly at her with those gray-green eyes that were alert and genuinely present, the way a person looks when they are actually paying attention, and he said, "I nearly walked you right over. I apologize." "It is all right," Sallie said. "I come around that corner every morning and I still never look before I do it." "You deliver eggs?" he asked, glancing at the basket. "Every morning," she said. "Hattie Monroe uses them for the boarders' breakfast." "Then I am in your debt," he said, with a slight smile that was not practiced or performed but simply genuine. "I was very much looking forward to breakfast." She laughed, because it was a funny thing to say, and because it was unexpected, and he smiled more fully when she laughed, as though her laugh was something he was glad to have caused. She introduced herself and he introduced himself, and they stood there for another minute talking about nothing in particular, about the cold snap and whether it was finished for the season, and Sallie was struck by the odd and slightly dizzying sensation of talking to a man who was listening to what she actually said. She delivered her eggs and walked home and did not think too much about it, because One pleasant exchange with a stranger on a spring morning was not something to build a great deal upon. She told herself this firmly and got on with her day. But Gilbert Fletcher did not behave like a stranger after that. He took his meals at Hattie's boarding house for the first week, and Sallie came every morning with her eggs, and every morning he was either finishing his breakfast inside or coming out to see to his horse, and every morning he stopped and spoke to her. Not in the excessive, effortful way of a man trying to make an impression, but in the natural, easy way of a person who genuinely enjoyed the conversation he was having. He asked her about her garden, and she told him about the frost and the ruined seedlings, and he told her that his grandmother in Tennessee had been a committed kitchen gardener, and had lost a whole year's worth of pepper seedlings to a late frost, and had apparently been furious for an entire calendar year afterward, which made Sallie laugh so hard she had to set her egg basket down on the porch step. He asked her what she was reading, and when she told him, he asked what she thought of it, and when she told him that too, he argued with her about it in a thoughtful and good-natured way that suggested he had actually read the same book and had his own real opinions. He had. He carried 2 books in his saddlebag, which she found entirely remarkable, and they spent a long morning arguing about the motivations of a particular character, while Sallie leaned against the porch rail, and the sun moved up the sky, and she was 20 minutes late getting home, and did not mind at all. He had been in Crestfall for 10 days before Sallie mentioned him to Ruth. They were sitting in Ruth's kitchen while Ruth's 2 boys, who were 4 and 6 and possessed of an apparently limitless supply of energy, ran in circles in the yard outside. Ruth was mending a shirt and Sallie was drinking coffee and watching the boys through the window. "There is a new man at Hattie's," Sallie said. Ruth looked up with the sharpness of a woman who knew her friend very well. "New man. A trail boss hired by Edward Prentice for the June drive. His name is Gilbert Fletcher. He rode in from East Texas." Ruth set down her mending. And nothing," Sallie said. "I just mentioned it." "You have not just mentioned a man to me in 4 years, Ruth said. "That is not true. Name me one." Sallie could not name one. "Tell me about him," Ruth said, picking her mending back up with an air of supreme contentment. So Sallie told her, and she told her more than she had intended to, about the books in the saddlebag and the story about his grandmother's pepper seedlings and the way he argued about literature in a way that was engaged and funny and never condescending. And while she talked, she became aware that Ruth was not looking at her mending at all. Ruth was watching Sallie's face. "What?" Sallie said. "Nothing," Ruth said serenely. "Absolutely nothing. Go on. I have said all there is to say. Does he look at you?" Ruth asked. The question was so direct that Sallie felt her face get warm, which was irritating. "What a strange question," she said. "It is not a strange question at all. Does he look at you? When you are talking, when you walk away, does he look at you the way you deserve to be looked at?" Sallie stared at her coffee cup. She thought about the way his eyes came to her face and stayed there when she spoke, the way he leaned slightly toward the conversation instead of away from it, the way he had said, once, "You have an excellent mind, Miss Doyle," in such a matter-of-fact tone that it had not felt like flattery at all, but simply like an observation he was making because it was true. "He looks at me," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she had meant it to. Ruth smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for this for a very long time. The following Sunday, Crestfall held its regular church service, and its regular post-service gathering on the green beside the church, which was the social center of the week and involved considerable quantities of pie and gossip, and the particular competitive neighborliness that small communities excel at. Gilbert Fletcher came to the service, which surprised no one, since Hattie Monroe herself attended, and she made it clear to her boarders that church attendance on Sunday morning was something she considered a basic mark of civilization. Sallie saw him come in and sit in the 3rd pew from the back, and she sat in her usual place near the middle with her father, who was 71 and slightly deaf, and spent most of the sermon nodding with the serene conviction of a man who was following along perfectly despite having heard perhaps 40% of it. She did not look back at Gilbert Fletcher during the service, partly out of propriety, and partly because she was not entirely certain she could manage it without being obvious about it. After the service on the green, it was Clara Pratt who went to speak to Gilbert first, because Clara Pratt was the sort of woman who walked directly toward things she was interested in, which Sallie found admirable in the abstract and moderately painful in this particular instance. Clara was pretty and animated, and she laughed a great deal, and Gilbert was polite to her in the way he seemed to be polite to everyone, which was genuinely and without performance. Sallie was standing near the pie table with her father and Ruth when she watched this exchange from across the green, and she told herself she was not watching it, and Ruth, who was standing beside her, said quietly and without looking up from her own plate, "He just looked over here." "He did not," Sallie said. "He did," Ruth said. "And he is looking again." Sallie looked. He was. He caught her eye across the crowded green and smiled. Not the polite social smile he had just given Clara Pratt, but the real one, the one that reached his eyes, and he excused himself from the conversation he was in and walked across the green toward her. Clara Pratt watched him go with an expression of mild surprise, and Sallie felt something warm and startling unfurl in her chest. He greeted her father first, which was correct and kind, because Thomas Doyle was a proud old man who liked to be acknowledged properly, and he shook the old man's hand and said he had heard Mr. Doyle had done survey work for the railroad and asked him about it. And Thomas Doyle lit up like a lantern and began talking with great enthusiasm. And Gilbert listened and asked good questions, and Sallie watched this happen with a feeling that she could not have named precisely, but that had something to do with tenderness and something to do with terror. When her father was eventually drawn away by the Reverend Albright, who wanted to discuss a matter of church business, Gilbert turned to Sallie and said, "Your father is a remarkable man. I could listen to him talk about the survey work for hours." "He could certainly talk about it for hours," Sallie said. "I have heard the story of the Red River crossing at least 30 times, and I still find new details in it." "The best stories are like that," Gilbert said. They stood together in the mild Sunday warmth and ate pie and talked, and at some point Sallie became aware that the conversation they were having was the most fully engaged she had felt in the company of any person, not just any man, but any person, in longer than she cared to think about. He talked about his years on the trail with a plainness that was neither boastful nor falsely modest, just honest. He had worked cattle since he was 17, starting as a simple drover in Central Texas and working his way up through sheer reliability, and a talent for reading both weather and livestock that his first trail boss had recognized immediately. He had seen the country between Texas and Kansas from horseback a dozen times and never got entirely tired of it, though he was honest enough to say that the work was brutal and unglamorous, and that anyone who told you otherwise had not done it. He asked her about her life with the same straightforward interest, and she found herself telling him things she did not ordinarily tell people, about the books and the poetry, and the fact that she had once, 3 years ago, written 3 letters to the editors of various newspapers in Austin and Houston offering to submit a regular column on the subject of practical domestic agriculture, and had received 2 polite rejections and 1 letter that was not polite at all. He was briefly and satisfyingly outraged on her behalf, and then he said, "What was in the column?" And she told him. He listened. He commented. He asked about a particular technique she had mentioned for soil amendment, and she explained it, and he said, "My grandmother would have wanted to meet you." And there was something in the way he said it, quietly and simply, that made her look away for a moment so that he would not see the expression on her face. The post-church social broke up in the early afternoon, and the Doyle family's wagon was loaded up with the pie dish, and the folded church blanket and Thomas Doyle's good coat. And Sallie climbed up onto the seat, and Gilbert Fletcher helped her father up after her because the old man's knee had been giving him trouble. And Thomas Doyle thanked him, and Gilbert said it was nothing, and Sallie drove the wagon home and spent the entire drive home in a state of pleasant and slightly alarmed internal conversation with herself about whether or not she was being foolish. She concluded, sitting at her kitchen table with the afternoon light falling through the window and the sound of her hens in the yard outside, that she was probably being foolish. He was a trail boss hired for a single drive. He would leave in June. He would be in Crestfall for 3 months at most, and then he would follow the herd north to Abilene, and she would be here, same as always, delivering her eggs every morning and tending her garden and reading her books, and everything would be exactly as it had been before. She knew better than to put her heart in the path of something that was passing through. She picked up her book and read until supper and told herself she had settled it. The next morning she came around the corner of Hattie Monroe's boarding house with her egg basket, and Gilbert was sitting on the back porch step with 2 cups of coffee, and he held one out toward her as she came around the corner, easy as anything, as if this were a thing they did every morning, as if her coffee were a fact of the day as established as the sunrise. "How did you know I was coming?" she asked, taking the cup because refusing it would have been absurd. "You come every morning at 7:10, he said. "I have been here 10 days. I have observed the pattern." She sat on the step beside him, because there was no graceful way not to, and they drank their coffee in the spring morning air, and the conversation started where it had left off the previous day, as easily as breathing, and Sallie sat there with her coffee warming her hands, and the sun coming up over the rooftops of Crestfall, and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was in serious trouble. It was Harold Fitch who first put it into words, and he did it without knowing what he was saying, which was entirely characteristic of Harold Fitch. It was a Tuesday evening about 3 weeks after Gilbert had arrived, and Sallie had gone to the general store to buy salt and found Harold Fitch there, leaning on the counter and talking to Clyde Birch, who owned the store, in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere pressing to be. "That Fletcher fellow," Harold said to Clyde, apparently continuing a conversation that had been going before Sallie came in, "has some peculiar notions. I saw him walking with Sallie Doyle along the creek road yesterday afternoon, bold as you please, and stopping to show her something in the water, frogs or water bugs or some such thing. Grown man interested in water bugs." Clyde Birch looked over at Sallie as she came to the counter and said, "50 cents for the salt, Sallie," and went back to the conversation without a pause. "I do not know what he sees in her," Harold continued, and his tone was not mean, which was somehow worse than if it had been. It was simply puzzled, genuinely puzzled. "She is a nice enough girl, but there is nothing particularly remarkable about her, is there, compared to, say, Clara Pratt?" Sallie set her coin on the counter and picked up her salt and walked out of the store and stood on the boardwalk in the evening air and breathed for a moment slowly, until the flush in her face had subsided. She had heard this before. Not these exact words, but this exact sentiment, this assessment of herself as a pleasant nothing, a background feature of the town like the water trough or the hitching post, present and unremarkable. She had heard it her whole adult life in various forms. It should not have landed the way it did. She had built good, strong walls around that particular wound, and she did not ordinarily let it through. But this time it was paired with his name, and she had not been ready for that. She walked home in the growing dusk and did not tell Ruth about it, because Ruth would have gone to find Harold Fitch and said something pointed and satisfying and probably embarrassing. And Sallie did not want the satisfaction. She wanted to simply let it settle to the bottom where it belonged. But she could not quite make herself stop thinking about it, because Harold Fitch had said, "I do not know what he sees in her," with genuine bewilderment, and underneath the sting of it was a small, treacherous question that Sallie hated herself a little for asking, which was, "What does he see?" She saw Gilbert the following morning, same as always, coffee on the porch step, conversation picking up its thread. She was careful that morning to be a little more contained than usual, a little more collected, because she did not want to be foolish and she had been allowing herself to not be entirely careful, and that was its own kind of danger. He noticed. He did not say anything for about 10 minutes, but he noticed, and she could see him noticing, and then he said in the middle of a perfectly ordinary observation about the weather, "Is something wrong?" "No," she said, "nothing at all." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are different this morning." "I am exactly the same as I always am," she said. He looked at her steadily and said, "No, you are not." She almost told him. She was surprised by how much she almost told him, because she was not in the habit of telling people things like this. She was in the habit of keeping it neat and private and managing it herself. But something about the way he was looking at her, with that direct and uncomplicated attention, made the almost very strong. She did not tell him. She changed the subject, and the morning moved on, and she went home and planted her seedlings, and told herself she was being very sensible. What she could not have known, and did not find out until later, was that Gilbert had gone into the general store himself that same afternoon for tobacco, and had come in on the tail end of a similar conversation. This one between Harold Fitch and Pete Carver, Ruth's husband, about the odd business of the trail boss being so interested in Sallie Doyle, when there were more obviously attractive prospects available to him. Pete Carver, to his credit, had said that he thought Sallie was fine company and a good woman, but he had said it in the mild, affectionate way of a man speaking of a friend's wife, rather than in any tone that suggested he comprehended her fully. And Harold had shaken his head and said, "Well, a man with Fletcher's background could probably afford to be eccentric in his choices." Gilbert had stood inside the door of the store and listened to this, and Clyde Birch had not noticed him come in and had joined the conversation with his opinion, which was that Sallie was a sensible girl but a quiet one, and perhaps that suited a man who spent most of his time on the trail. And then he had looked up and seen Gilbert standing there. There was a moment of silence. Gilbert walked to the counter and bought his tobacco, and then he said, quietly and without heat, "She is the most interesting woman I have met in 5 states, and I cannot understand how none of you have noticed." Harold Fitch opened his mouth. Gilbert put his tobacco in his shirt pocket and walked out. He did not tell Sallie he had said this, not that day, not that week. What he did instead was show up at her front gate on a Saturday morning with 2 horses, his roan and a bay mare he had borrowed from Harold Fitch's livery, and knock on the gate post and say, when she came to the door, "Would you ride with me? I want to see the creek and the range land east of town, and I would rather see it with company." She looked at the horses and she looked at him and she said, "Give me 10 minutes." She told her father where she was going, changed her shoes to her boots, pinned her bonnet more securely, and came out through the gate and let him help her up onto the bay mare, and they rode out east in the morning light. They rode for 2 hours through the spring Texas landscape, which was beautiful and enormous in the way of that country. The sky so wide it felt almost architectural, the prairie grass that pale, luminous green of early spring, the creek winding through its shallow valley with its cottonwoods and willows, and the sound of water that in that dry land was as welcome and specific as a voice. They talked the entire way, and they were also silent for stretches, the comfortable silence of 2 people who do not need to fill all the air between them. He pulled up his horse at the crest of a low hill that overlooked a long sweep of grassland running east toward the horizon, and she stopped beside him, and they sat there on their horses in the wind. "It is beautiful country," he said. "I have never not loved it," she said. "Even when it is hard, when the drought comes or the wind is terrible, I have never stopped loving it." He looked at her, not at the landscape, and he said, "Have you ever wanted to leave?" She considered the question honestly, because he was asking it honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "When I was younger I thought I wanted to see more of the world. I wanted to go east or to San Francisco. I read about San Francisco in a book and thought it sounded extraordinary." "Is it extraordinary?" she asked. "Have you seen it?" "I have not been farther west than New Mexico," he said, but I think anywhere can be extraordinary if you are looking at it right." She thought about that for a moment and then she said, "Yes, I think that is true." They rode back to town in the late morning and he returned the bay mare to the livery and walked her to her gate. And at the gate he turned to her and said, "Thank you for coming with me." "Thank you for asking," she said. He looked at her for a moment in that particular way he had, and then he said, "Miss Doyle, I would like to ask you something." "All right," she said. "May I call on you formally, not just the morning coffee and the Sunday conversation, but actually call on you with your father's knowledge and permission as a man who is interested in you?" Her heart did something complicated and large. She said, "You would have to ask my father." "I know," he said. "I am asking you first." The honesty of that, the fact that he asked her first, was so specifically and perfectly correct that she felt it somewhere behind her sternum, a kind of ache that was also its own particular warmth. She said, "Yes. You may ask him." Thomas Doyle was delighted. This was perhaps not the most romantic word for a father's response to a man's request to court his daughter, but it was the accurate one. Thomas Doyle had been watching his daughter be invisible to the men of Crestfall for years with the quiet, helpless frustration of a father who knows his child's worth and cannot compel the world to recognize it. And when Gilbert Fletcher sat in his kitchen that afternoon and told him plainly that he admired Sallie and wanted to court her properly, Thomas Doyle shook his hand and said he could not think of anything he was more in favor of, and then embarrassed everyone slightly by becoming emotional, which he covered by immediately getting up to put the kettle on. So Gilbert Fletcher courted Sallie Doyle. He came on Sunday afternoons and sat in the Doyle front parlor and talked to Thomas, and then talked to Sallie with Thomas diplomatically occupied in the next room. He brought Sallie a book he had ordered from a bookseller in Austin, which arrived 3 weeks after he placed the order, and which was a collection of botanical essays that he thought she would like, because she had mentioned once in passing that she was interested in native Texas plants and their practical uses, and she nearly wept when she opened it, not from sentimentality, but from the shock of being heard so precisely. He walked with her on weekday evenings when the weather was good, and they went to the creek and to the edge of town where the prairie opened up wide and free, and they talked about everything. He told her about his family, his mother who had died when he was 12 of a fever, his father who had worked cattle his whole life and died from a riding accident when Gilbert was 19, his younger sister in East Texas named Josephine who was married to a schoolteacher and had 3 children and wrote Gilbert long, entertaining letters that he carried in his saddlebag along with his books. He had no permanent home, which was something he said plainly and without apology but also without pride. He had lived in bunkhouses and boarding houses and under the stars, and he was 30 years old and beginning to feel, for the first time in his life, that he would like to stop moving. "Where would you stop?" she asked. They were sitting on the bank of the creek, and the late afternoon light was golden and enormous, and the cottonwoods were throwing their seeds on the air in little white drifts. He looked at her and then looked at the creek and then looked at her again and said, "Somewhere with good water and a long growing season, and a woman who argues about books and knows everything there, is to know about kitchen gardens." She looked at the creek so she would not have to look at him, because if she looked at him her face would do something she was not ready for yet. They sat in a silence that was full of meaning, and neither of them said the thing that was most evident yet, because it was too soon and they were both careful people in their own ways, though careful for different reasons and different histories. The town, of course, noticed. Small towns have a metabolism of social awareness that is both their best and worst feature, and Crestfall was no exception. By the end of April, the fact of Gilbert Fletcher's formal courtship of Sallie Doyle was universally known and universally discussed, and the reactions were a fairly representative sample of human nature. Ruth Carver was radiant with vindicated satisfaction, and told everyone who would listen that she had known Sallie Doyle was remarkable since the age of 16, and the only question had been whether the right person would ever have the sense to see it. Hattie Monroe, who liked Gilbert as a boarder and had always had a quiet fondness for Sallie, told people it was a very natural development, and she was glad of it. Clara Pratt was gracious about it in the way of a woman who had other options and knew it. The Reverend Albright said something uplifting about Providence. Harold Fitch said, to several different people in the course of several different conversations, that he still could not entirely understand it, and he said it without malice, with only the sincere bewilderment of a man whose categories of perception did not include what he was seeing. One evening in early May, Gilbert and Sallie were walking back from the creek in the fading light, and they passed Harold Fitch coming the other direction. And Harold greeted Gilbert with a nod and Sallie with a slightly uncertain smile that suggested he was working something out. And after he had passed, Gilbert said, "He looks at you like he is trying to solve a problem he does not have the right tools for." Sallie almost smiled. "He told Clyde Birch in March that there was nothing particularly remarkable about me," she said, and she said it lightly because she had decided to say it lightly, and also because she wanted to say it out loud to someone at least once. Gilbert stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and then stopped too and turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was very still and very serious, and something else, something warm that was building up behind the seriousness the way a river backs up behind a dam. "He said that," Gilbert said. "I do not take it as cruelty," she said. "He genuinely does not see. A great many people in this town genuinely do not see, and I have made my peace with it." "Have you?" Gilbert said, and it was not entirely a question. "Mostly," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a tone that was very measured and deliberate, as though he were choosing each word with care and purpose, "I do not understand it. I have spent these 2 months trying to understand it, and I cannot. You are funny and intelligent and honest, and you have more genuine curiosity about the world than anyone I have encountered in a very long time. You are also beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with being flashy and everything to do with being real, and I cannot understand how a town full of grown men who have known you for years have simply looked past that. I genuinely cannot." The light was going amber and low, and the cottonwood seeds were drifting on the air, and Crestfall sat quiet and familiar in the evening distance, and Sallie Doyle stood on the road and looked at Gilbert Fletcher and felt the last of the walls she had built come down so completely and so cleanly that there was no rubble, nothing jagged, just a great cleared space where they had been. She said, "Gilbert." "Yes," he said. "I think I am in love with you." He crossed the 2 steps between them in one motion and took her face in both his hands, very gently, and looked at her for just a moment. And then he said, "I have been in love with you since the morning I almost walked you over behind Hattie Monroe's boarding house and you laughed." And then he kissed her, right there on the road in the last of the golden light, with the cottonwood seeds falling around them like snow. She kissed him back with the full, unhesitating warmth of a woman who had waited long enough and knew exactly what she was doing. And it was exactly as it should have been, which is to say that it was real and it was warm, and it was completely and entirely enough. Ruth Carver, who happened to be driving past in Pete's wagon at exactly that moment on her way back from visiting a neighbor, saw the whole thing and pulled the wagon to a halt, and sat there with both hands over her mouth and happy tears running down her face, and then made the wagon go forward again as quickly as she could without making any noise, which was a feat she managed with considerable grace. May moved toward June, and June brought the reality of the cattle drive, and with it, a conversation that both of them had been circling for some time. They were on the creek bank in the first week of June, a Sunday afternoon, and the day was warm and the sky had the full, deep blue of early summer, and the wildflowers were out in the grass along the bank, Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets and evening primrose. Sallie was sitting with her back against a cottonwood, and Gilbert was lying in the grass with his hat over his face against the sun, and the conversation that had been building for weeks between them finally arrived. "The drive goes in 10 days, he said from under his hat. "I know," she said. "It will take 3 months at minimum. Could be 4, depending on the pace and the conditions and the market in Abilene. I know that too, she said. He pushed his hat back and sat up and looked at her with those gray-green eyes. I do not want to leave without making something clear, he said. Then make it clear, she said, because she was a direct person even when directness was frightening. I want to come back, he said. Not just to Crestfall. I want to come back to you. I want to court you properly through the fall and winter, and in the spring, if you are willing, I want to ask you to marry me. I am not asking now because you deserve more time than a month and a half, and because I want to make the ask properly with real prospects to put on the table. But I want you to know that is what I intend, so that the months I am gone are not uncertain. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "That is a very organized declaration." "I am a very organized person," he said. "On the trail I am anyway. I know what I want and I like to have a clear plan for getting it." "And am I something to be got?" she said, but she was smiling when she said it. "No," he said immediately and seriously. "You are something to be asked. Properly and honestly, and with full knowledge of what I am and what I have, and what I am hoping to build. I have been thinking about land east of town. There is a section along the creek that Prentice mentioned might be available at fair price after the drive, good water access, decent grazing, room enough for a proper garden." He paused. "I wanted to plant that image in your mind, so you could think about it while I am gone and decide whether it matches anything you might want." She thought about the land east of town along the creek, which she knew, which she had walked across 100 times. She thought about the creek access and the flat southern exposure that would be perfect for a kitchen garden, and the cottonwoods that were old enough to give shade. She thought about a house on that land with a room for books and a man who carried books in his saddlebag and argued about literature, and thought she had an excellent mind. "It matches," she said quietly. He reached across and took her hand and held it, just held it, sitting in the summer grass in the Texas sun, and they stayed like that for a long time without saying anything else because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The drive left on the 12th of June with Edward Prentice's 3,000 head and 8 drovers, and Gilbert Fletcher at the front of it, on his big roan horse with the white blaze. Sallie came to the edge of town to see them off, because she was not going to pretend she was indifferent, and Gilbert rode up to where she was standing at the fence line and leaned down from the saddle and said, in a voice low enough for only her, "I will write every week. You write back." "Every week," she said. He put 2 fingers to his hat brim and turned the roan and rode north with the herd, and Sallie stood at the fence and watched until the dust cloud was a smudge on the horizon, and then until there was nothing to see at all. She went home and wrote him a letter that afternoon. She told him about the garden, which was doing beautifully now that the frost damage had been repaired, and about her father, who had been in good spirits and had spent the morning telling her the Red River crossing story in a new version that included a detail she had not heard before, a detail about a surveyor's compass that had been dropped in the water and recovered 3 days later by a Caddo fisherman who had asked for very reasonable compensation. She told him she had read 20 pages of the botanical essay collection he had given her and found 3 species she wanted to attempt to cultivate in the garden next season. She told him that Ruth had invited her to dinner on Sunday and that Pete Carver had asked after Gilbert with what seemed like genuine interest, which she found hopeful. She did not tell him that she had stood at the fence line for a very long time after the dust cloud disappeared because that felt like something too personal to put in a first letter, but she thought about it while she wrote, the way you think about a thing while doing something else. His first letter came 3 weeks into June, written from a camp on the Red River, brief because the nights on the trail were short and he was tired to the bone, but full of the specific details of the world around him. The enormous sky, the sound of 3,000 cattle settling for the night, the way one of the younger drovers, a boy named Amos who could not have been more than 18, had been teaching himself to play the harmonica by campfire light, badly and with tremendous enthusiasm. He said he had read 30 pages of his book and thought about Sallie on most of them. She wrote back the same day she received it and put the letter in the postal pouch, headed north the following morning. They wrote each other through July and into August, their letters crossing on the trail, creating a correspondence that was asynchronous and therefore required both of them to write into a kind of trust, not knowing when the next letter would arrive, just putting words into the post and believing they would get there. Sallie found she loved this, the letters, the sitting down at her kitchen table in the evening lamplight to write and to read. His letters were exactly what she might have expected from a man who carried books in his saddlebag and argued about literature, full of observation and honesty and occasional dry humor, and her own letters grew longer as the summer went on. Until by August, she was writing him 6- and 8-page letters that covered everything from the garden to her opinions on the political situation in the state, to a detailed description of a thunderstorm she had watched from her front porch that had lasted 4 hours and been the most dramatic weather event she had witnessed in several years. He wrote back about the thunderstorm, saying they had had the same storm on the trail 2 days later, that far north, and one of the drovers had been briefly struck by lightning, or near enough to it that the man's boots had been blown off his feet, and he had been fine, only stunned, and Amos had not played the harmonica for 3 days afterward out of respect for the event. Sallie read this to her father, and Thomas Doyle laughed until he cried. The town continued in its rhythms around her, and Sallie continued in hers. She harvested the garden, which was spectacularly productive, and put up jar after jar of tomatoes and beans and peppers and pickled cucumbers, and helped her father with the work that was getting harder for him as the summer aged, the heavier tasks around the property that his knee made difficult. And she continued her egg delivery to Hattie Monroe and her visits with Ruth and her books and her Saturday trips to the general store, all of the same ordinary life she had always lived. But it felt different from the inside. It felt occupied, full of something that had not been there before. She thought about the land along the creek east of town and what kind of house would suit it, and thought about this not with the dreamy vagueness of wishful thinking, but with the practical specificity of a woman who was actually planning something real. One Saturday afternoon in August, she walked out along the creek road to look at the land Gilbert had mentioned, the section east of town with good creek access. She walked its full extent, about 40 acres of open grassland running down to the creek, with a stand of mature cottonwoods along the water and level ground on the north side of the creek that was ideal for building. The soil along the southern exposure was dark and deep. She crouched down and took a handful of it and let it fall through her fingers, and it was exactly the kind of soil you could grow anything in, rich and dark and slightly sandy at the edges, where the creek had influenced it over years. She sat on the bank of the creek in the August heat and looked at the land and thought, yes, this was the right kind of place for the things she wanted, which were modest and specific and entirely clear to her. A house with a real kitchen, and a room for books and a proper kitchen garden, and the company of a man who would argue about literature and carry books in his saddlebag, and say, in a matter-of-fact way that was not flattery but simple, accurate observation, that she had an excellent mind. She wrote him a letter that evening and told him she had walked the land, and that it was everything he had said it was, and she described the soil and the cottonwoods and the southern exposure. And she said, near the end of the letter, that she had been thinking about what kind of kitchen garden would be possible in that soil, and she thought native peppers would do particularly well along the south wall of a future house, in memory of his grandmother's lost peppers if nothing else. His reply, when it came, was the longest letter he had written yet, from a camp outside of Abilene, where the drive had arrived 2 weeks ahead of schedule, because the conditions had been excellent and Gilbert had set a good pace. He told her about the drive's end, the market in Abilene, the noise and bustle of that cattle town after months of open prairie. He told her he was settling the pay for his drovers, and that Amos had become a genuinely competent harmonica player by the time they arrived, which the whole outfit celebrated properly. He told her he had spoken to Edward Prentice before leaving for the north about the land along the creek, and Prentice had confirmed it was available and had quoted a fair price that Gilbert had the means to meet after this season's pay. And then, at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the rest of the letter, as if the evenness had worn off by the time he got there, he wrote, "I am coming home, Sallie. I will be in Crestfall by the first week of September. I have been thinking about what I want to ask you since I left, and I have been thinking about the fact that I intend to ask it properly and that you deserve a proper asking. I will be there by September." She read this sitting at her kitchen table at 8 o'clock in the morning with her coffee and the summer light coming through the window, and she sat very still for a moment with the letter in her hands, and then she put her head down on her arms on the table and stayed there for about 2 minutes, smiling into the wood. Then she got up and finished her coffee and went to deliver her eggs, and she told Ruth, because she could not tell Ruth, and Ruth grabbed both of her arms and said, "I knew it. I knew it from the day I saw your face when you said his name." And then Ruth's boys came barreling in from the yard, and the moment became cheerful chaos, which was appropriate, because the feeling inside Sallie was also a kind of cheerful chaos. Gilbert Fletcher rode back into Crestfall on the 3rd of September, 1878, on a Tuesday afternoon when the summer heat was just beginning to yield its first degree of ground to the approaching fall. The sky was still big and blue, but the edge of the air was different, a hint of something cooler coming from the north, and the light had that particular late summer angle that made everything look as if it were made of gold. Sallie was in her garden when she heard the horse on the road, and she straightened up and looked over the garden fence and saw him coming along the main street on his roan horse, and she put down her trowel and walked through the garden and through the gate and stood at the road. He saw her immediately because he had been looking for her, and he turned the horse toward her gate and came to a stop and dismounted, and she walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle of the road in a way that felt, despite everything, like the most natural thing in the world. He was leaner than when he left and darker from months of trail sun, and his hair was longer, and there was something in his face that was the same thing that was in her chest, which was the specific relief and rightness of returning to the thing you needed to return to. He took her hands and held them and looked at her and said, "I am back." "You are back," she said. "You look wonderful," he said. "You look like you have been driving cattle for 3 months," she said. "That is because I have been driving cattle for 3 months," he said. And then he laughed and she laughed, and they stood in the September road in the gold afternoon light. And it was both exactly what she had imagined and better, because reality always puts something in that imagination leaves out, and what it put in was the warmth of his hands and the specific sound of his laugh and the absolute solid reality of him standing there. He came to supper that evening, and her father was not subtle about his pleasure, and Sallie was not either, and afterward they sat on the front porch in the early September dark, and the air was just cool enough to be comfortable. And Gilbert reached into his coat pocket and took out a small ring, simple and silver, a band set with a small turquoise stone the color of the Texas sky. He held it out and said, "I have been thinking about how to say this properly for 3 months. I had several versions. They were all too long." She looked at the ring and looked at him and said, "Then say the short version." He said, "I love you. I want to marry you. I want to buy that land and build a house on it with a garden along the south wall and a room for books, and I want to spend the rest of my life in the company of the most interesting woman I have ever met. Will you marry me, Sallie Doyle?" she said. "Yes, Gilbert Fletcher. I will absolutely marry you." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the dark, and then she looked at him and she thought about Harold Fitch saying, "I do not know what he sees in her," with his honest bewilderment. And she thought about all the years of being a fence post, a background, a pleasant unremarkability, and she thought that she was glad she had waited, glad she had not settled for less than this. glad that she had spent those years becoming exactly and fully herself so that when he arrived and looked at her, he had something true and whole to see. She said none of this out loud. She did not need to. He already knew. They were married in November of 1878 in the Crestfall church, in a ceremony that the Reverend Albright performed with considerable warmth, and that the entire town attended because small towns attend weddings the way they attend everything, which is completely. Ruth Carver cried throughout, and Pete Carver put his arm around her and also appeared to be blinking at an unusual rate. Thomas Doyle sat in the front pew and was very upright and very dignified and only became emotional twice, which everyone agreed was admirable restraint. The land purchase along the creek had been completed in October, and by November a house was begun, built with the help of several men from town who came out on weekends to put up the walls and the roof, including Pete Carver, who turned out to be an excellent carpenter, and Harold Fitch, who came not entirely certain why he was there but who worked hard and said nothing inadequate. The house went up over the course of the fall and was not quite finished when they married, but finished enough, with walls and a roof and a fireplace and the beginnings of the kitchen garden's preparation along the south wall, the soil already turned and amended for spring planting. They moved in 2 days after the wedding. The first morning in their house, Sally stood in the kitchen in the thin November light and looked out the window at the creek and the cottonwoods, leafless now but enormous and beautiful in their bare November architecture. And Gilbert came in from seeing to his horse and stood behind her and put his arms around her, and they stood together looking at the same thing. "There is a lot of work still to do," he said. "I know," she said. "I have a list." He laughed. "Of course you do. It is an excellent list," she said, "very comprehensive." "Show me," he said. She showed him the list, which was indeed comprehensive and covered everything from the interior finishing to the planned layout of the kitchen garden, to the construction of a henhouse that would accommodate her flock, once she moved her birds from the old Doyle property. He read it with the full, serious attention he gave everything and then said, "The henhouse should go east of the garden, not south. You want the morning sun on the garden, not on the henhouse." "I had already considered that and reconsidered," she said. "The east side has poor drainage. If it is south of the garden, slightly offset, the shade in afternoon will actually moderate the temperature inside in summer." He looked at her. "You are absolutely right, and I withdraw my suggestion." "I accept the withdrawal," she said, and they both laughed, and she loved him so much in that moment that it was almost physically overwhelming. Just this ordinary morning in their ordinary kitchen with its ordinary argument about henhouse placement. And the love was not grand or dramatic, but it was enormous. The way the sky out there was enormous, big enough to hold everything. The winter passed with the work of finishing the house and settling into each other's daily rhythms, which was its own kind of discovery, learning how another person moves through the small hours of a day, their habits and preferences, and the particular way they exist in space. She learned that he was a very early riser, earlier even than she was, and that he liked to read for half an hour in the morning before doing anything else, which she found entirely sympathetic. He learned that she was absolutely not someone to be spoken to for the first 10 minutes of the morning before she had had her coffee, which he absorbed quickly and without complaint. She learned that he was a good cook in the specific, practical way of a man who had lived rough for years and learned to make the best of what was available, and that he made an excellent cornbread and was completely convinced that his method for doing so was the only correct method, which she found amusing and occasionally challenged, not because his cornbread was not excellent, but because the argument was enjoyable. He learned that she was not, as the town of Crestfall had apparently believed, a quiet or contained person, but that she had simply been insufficiently provided with interlocutors who warranted her full engagement, and that given a partner who would actually match her, she was funny and pointed and passionate about ideas, and completely willing to defend a position through 3 rounds of counterargument if she believed she was right, which she usually was. He told her, One January evening by the fire when they were arguing about something she later could not exactly remember. "You know what I thought the second time we talked, the morning of the coffee on the porch step?" "What?" she said. "I thought this woman has been waiting for someone who could keep up with her, and I very much hoped I was capable of it," she said. "You are, mostly." "Mostly," he repeated. "You fall short occasionally on the botanical side," she said. "That is fair," he agreed. Spring arrived, and with it the garden, planted along the south wall of the house exactly as they had planned, with native peppers in the place of honor, a nod to a grandmother in Tennessee who had lost hers to a frost and had apparently never quite recovered from the outrage of it. Sallie planted them from seeds she had been saving since the previous fall, and Gilbert helped her when the work required 2 sets of hands and stayed out of the way when it did not, which was itself a kind of gift, the understanding of when help was help and when it was interference. Thomas Doyle came for Sunday dinners and was happy in the way of a man who has reached the late chapter of his life and found it good. He and Gilbert had developed a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and long conversations about the history of the land, and Sallie would sometimes listen to them talk from the kitchen and feel the warmth of it like a stove in winter. By the summer of 1879, which was 1 full year after Gilbert had driven Prentice's herd north, things had settled into the shape they were going to have, not the finished, static shape of something over and done, but the living shape of something that was growing in all the ways that good things grow. Sallie discovered in July that she was expecting a baby. She told Gilbert on a warm summer evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the light go out of the sky above the creek, and his face did the thing she had hoped it would do, which was become completely and fully alive, all the way through, not just the surface of it but the whole depth of him. He took both her hands and held them and said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "I am very well." "Tell me what you need," he said. "Tell me everything you need and I will do it." "Right now I need you to stop looking at me as though I might break," she said, "because I am the most resilient woman in Crestfall, Texas, and I have survived a late frost and 3 months of missing you and 30 years of being a fence post in this town, and I am entirely capable of having a baby." He laughed and pulled her toward him and held her, and she leaned against his chest and felt his heart beating and the baby that was hardly more than a possibility yet, and the garden growing along the south wall and the creek running its reliable course through the cottonwoods, and she thought that the world was a very full place when you were living in it right. Their son was born in February of 1880, on a cold, clear night when the stars were enormous over the Texas plains, and they named him Thomas, after her father, which made Thomas Doyle Sr. Not even attempt to hide his emotion. The baby was loud and strong and had his father's gray-green eyes, and Sallie held him in the lamplight of their bedroom and felt the kind of love that is different from all other kinds of love, enormous and fierce and quietly terrifying, and also the most grounding thing she had ever known. Gilbert sat beside the bed and held her hand and looked at his son and said nothing for a long time, which was right, because some things do not need words around them. Ruth Carver came to see the baby and held him and said he was the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, which she said about every baby, but which she said about Thomas Fletcher with a particular warmth that had everything to do with knowing his mother and being glad down to the bone for everything that had led to this room, and this lamp, and this baby and his mother and father together. Thomas Doyle the elder came and held his grandson with the careful tenderness of a man of 72 whose hands were big and rough from a lifetime of outdoor work, and who held this child with absolute gentleness, and he looked at Sallie over the baby's head and he said, "Your mother would have loved him so much." And Sallie said, "I know." And they sat together in that for a moment, the presence of the person they had both loved and lost years before, made newly tender by this new beginning. Life moved forward in the way life does, not in dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that become, looked back upon, extraordinary. Gilbert took on trail boss work for a second drive the following summer, but arranged it so that he was gone only 2 months and had men he trusted to manage the herd's final approach while he rode back early. He came home in the August dust to find Sallie in the garden with the baby on a blanket in the shade nearby, and she looked up when she heard the horse and she smiled, and he dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and came across the garden, and the baby shrieked with the uncomplicated delight of a 1-year-old who knew this face. Gilbert picked up his son and held him and looked at Sallie over the baby's head and said, "I am not doing the long drives anymore." "You do not have to decide that now," she said. "I have decided it," he said. "I am going to talk to Prentice about managing his local operation. There is enough work in the county without going north. And I am going to ask Pete Carver if he wants a partner in the carpentry work he does in winter, because apparently I am better at building things than I previously understood." She looked at him. "You are sure?" "I am very sure," he said. "I have been away from home for 2 months and I want to be here. I want to be here for whatever comes next." Whatever came next was a daughter, born in the spring of 1882, who arrived into the world with a great deal of noise and an astonishing quantity of dark hair, which they did not expect, and they named her June for the month she had been conceived in, which was also the month Gilbert had left for the first drive in 1878, the month that had been the beginning of everything. June Fletcher was her parents' daughter in every way that mattered, which meant she was loud and curious, and had opinions from the first moment she could express them, and spent her early childhood following both of her parents around asking questions about everything she saw. She followed her mother through the kitchen garden and asked the name of every plant and why it grew and how, and she followed her father on his rounds of the property and asked why the cattle did the things they did, and whether the horses liked being ridden or only tolerated it as a matter of policy. Thomas Fletcher, her older brother, was quieter and more observant, with his father's steady eyes and his mother's internal life, and he was the kind of child who listened to everything and stored it, and produced it back 6 months later in a perfectly formed sentence that made both his parents realize he had been attending to far more than he appeared to be. Crestfall grew around them as the 1880s moved forward, because Texas was growing and the towns along the rail lines were growing with it, and new families came, and the town put in a second general store and a new school building to replace the small original one, and there were more children for Thomas and June to grow up with, and more people at the Sunday socials, and the church gatherings, and the summer dances that became a regular feature of the town's social calendar. Sallie was not invisible in Crestfall anymore. This was not because she had become a different person. She had not become someone louder or flashier or more obviously remarkable by the town's previous standard. She was still exactly who she had always been, warm and practical and funny and brilliantly intelligent and deeply engaged with everything that interested her. But she existed now in a context that was different, the context of a life being lived fully and visibly, with a husband who looked at her the way Gilbert looked at her, and children who were loud and funny and well-loved, and a garden along the south wall of a house along the creek that the whole town passed on the creek road, and that people called the most beautiful kitchen garden in the county, because it was. She also wrote for the newspaper. Not a grand newspaper in Austin or Houston, but the Crestfall Gazette, which the town established in 1881 with a second-hand printing press, and a young editor from San Antonio named Daniel Reeves who had energy and ambition and very good judgment, and who, when Sallie approached him in the spring of 1882 with the idea for a regular column on practical domestic agriculture, was intelligent enough to say yes immediately. The column ran every other week and covered everything from soil amendment techniques to the cultivation of native plants to the management of drought conditions in kitchen gardens, and it was widely read, not only in Crestfall but in neighboring towns, and Daniel Reeves received letters about it, complimentary letters, which he passed along to Sallie with great satisfaction. Ruth Carver read every column and told Sallie after the first one, "I wish I could find the editors who sent you those rejection letters and mail them a copy." "I thought about doing that," Sallie said. "What stopped you?" "Nothing stopped me. I just decided I was happier moving forward than looking back." Ruth shook her head. "You are a better woman than I am." "You are an excellent woman," Sallie said. "You are simply differently motivated." Gilbert read every column too, which she did not tell him he needed to do, and he came to her after the fourth one with a question about a technique she had described, and they spent a long evening in a discussion that was partly agricultural and partly philosophical, and mostly just the kind of conversation that had been happening between them since a spring morning in 1878, when they had almost collided behind Hattie Monroe's boarding house. Harold Fitch was still in Crestfall and still ran the livery, and over the years that followed, he was never entirely sure what to make of the Fletchers, which was the closest thing he could manage to understanding that he had been wrong about something. He was not a bad man. He was simply a limited one. He brought his horse to Gilbert for consultation when the animal had a hoof problem in 1883, and he tipped his hat to Sallie when she passed on the boardwalk, and he subscribed to the Gazette, and whether he read her column was something she was never certain of, and did not particularly need to be. Thomas Doyle, who had moved into the guest room of the Fletcher house along the creek when it became clear that his knee and his age were making the management of his own property increasingly difficult, died peacefully in the spring of 1884, in his own bed, at the age of 74. He had 2 grandchildren who climbed on him with complete impunity, and a daughter he was proud of in every possible way, and a son-in-law he respected and liked. And he had more than enough, and he knew it. Sallie sat with him the last night and held his hand and told him the Red River crossing story the way she knew it, with all 30 versions of it folded in, and he smiled. And in the morning he was gone, and it was grief, real and heavy, the kind that does not move quickly or neatly. But it was also a grief set inside the fullness of a life rather than the emptiness of one, and that made it possible to hold. Gilbert was beside her through all of it, through the burial and the long weeks after, and the particular sorrow of going through a parent's things. And he held her when she cried and talked with her when she needed to talk and was quiet when she needed quiet. And there was nothing he did or said that was wrong, not because he was perfect, but because he was paying attention, the same thorough and genuine attention he had been paying her from the moment he had almost walked into her behind the boarding house. One afternoon in June, a year after her father's death, Sallie went out to the kitchen garden in the warm morning and knelt in the soil and worked for an hour and then sat back on her heels and looked at what she had grown. The peppers were beautiful that year, native chili varieties that were producing abundantly, red and orange and the deep dark green of the unripe ones, and the tomatoes were coming, and the beans were climbing their poles, and the whole south wall was a profusion of growing things. She thought about the woman she had been in the spring of 1878, kneeling in this same kind of soil at her father's house, replanting frost-killed seedlings with the patient acceptance of a woman who had made her peace with being unseen. And she thought about everything that had grown since then, not just the garden but all of it. Thomas and June and the column in the Gazette, and the house along the creek and the long conversations by firelight and the letters that had crossed on the trail and the ring with the turquoise stone on her finger. And she thought about Gilbert saying, with that quiet and genuine outrage, "I cannot understand how a town full of men who have known you for years have." Simply looked past that. She thought she understood it now from the inside, in a way she had not entirely understood it then. The men of Crestfall had not seen her because seeing requires a particular kind of attention, the kind that goes past the surface and the obvious and the immediately easy, and they had been looking for the easy and obvious version of interesting, and she had never been that. She was the other kind. The kind that reveals itself slowly to the patient and the attentive and the genuinely curious. She had always known this about herself, but she had not been certain, in her younger years, that there would be someone patient enough to find it. There had been. Gilbert came around the corner of the house from the barn, and she looked up, and he stopped when he saw her face. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Come look at the peppers." He came and crouched beside her and looked at the peppers, which were extraordinary, and he said, "My grandmother's spirit is satisfied wherever she is." "I think so," Sallie said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You have that look you get when you have been thinking something large." "I was thinking about the spring of 1878, she said. "Before or after you almost walked into me?" "Before," she said. "I was replanting these seedlings. It was before you arrived. I did not know you existed." He sat down in the dirt beside her, which was completely like him, and said, "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about how full life is now compared to then," she said, "and how strange it is that one person can change the entire texture of a life." He looked at the garden and then at her and said, "You changed mine too, you know that." "I know it," she said. "Before I came to Crestfall," he said, "I had been moving for 12 years. I did not know I was looking for something. I thought I was just working and living, and that was what there was. And then I came around a corner and almost knocked over a woman with an egg basket who laughed at me, and I thought, there it is. That is the thing I did not know I was looking for." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the summer morning, with the peppers growing and the creek running and the birds making their noise in the cottonwoods, and she said, "We are rather good together." "We are extraordinarily good together," he said, with the serene certainty of a man who knew exactly what he had and was not inclined to understate it. They sat in the garden in the June sun for a long time, until the sound of their children in the house became loud enough to require attention, at which point Sallie stood and brushed the dirt from her knees and held out her hand, and Gilbert took it, and they went inside together, into the noise and warmth of the life they had built. June Fletcher, who was 2 years old and in the phase of her life where she had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them, was standing in the kitchen demanding to know why there was no cornbread. And Thomas, who was 4 and endlessly patient with his sister in the way of a child who had inherited the temperament of 2 very solid people, was explaining to her that cornbread was a supper item and not a morning item, and she was not convinced. Gilbert picked June up and told her there would be cornbread at supper, and she accepted this with the grave seriousness of a person who has decided to extend trust on a provisional basis. And Sallie looked at her daughter in her husband's arms and her son at the table, explaining the taxonomy of meal times with profound 4-year-old earnestness, and she thought, this is it. This is the extraordinary, ordinary thing. This is what she had been growing toward through all the invisible years without knowing it, through all the mornings of delivering eggs and tending gardens and reading books alone and being looked through and looked past, growing into herself fully enough that, when the right person finally looked directly at her, there was so much there to see that he had said, with honest and genuine bewilderment, that he could not understand how anyone had missed it. She could not entirely understand it either anymore. Not because she had become vain or self-important, but because she understood now that invisibility had never been about what she lacked. It had always been about what the people looking had failed to bring to the seeing. Gilbert had brought the right thing, the full and patient attention of a man who was genuinely curious about the world and the people in it, and what he had found when he looked was everything she had always been. Ruth Carver came to Sunday dinner that week, as she often did, and she and Sallie sat on the porch after the meal while the men did the washing up inside and the children ran in the yard. And the late afternoon light was that particular gold that summer afternoons in Texas produce, warm and enormous and generous. Ruth looked at her friend for a long moment and then said, "Are you happy, Sallie?" Sallie considered the question, because Ruth always asked it and always meant it sincerely and deserved a sincere answer. She looked at the yard where June was attempting to instruct Thomas in the correct way to run, which was apparently with more enthusiasm than he was currently displaying, and she looked at the house they had built, the good solid walls and the kitchen garden along the south wall where the peppers were ripening, and she listened to the sound of Gilbert and Pete talking inside, the the deep, comfortable sound of men who liked each other. "I am happy," she said. "Genuinely and specifically happy." "Good," Ruth said, and her voice was full of the particular contentment of a person who has wanted something for their friend for a very long time and has lived to see it come true. "That is exactly what you always deserved." Sallie smiled. She thought about the fence post. She thought about being a window rather than a person in Clyde Birch's store. She thought about Harold Fitch's bewildered, "I cannot understand what he sees in her." And she thought about Gilbert standing in the road outside the general store saying, "I cannot understand how none of you have noticed." She thought that the difference between those two statements was the whole story. Everything that mattered was in the difference between those two statements. The years would continue as years do. Gilbert would expand the local cattle operation and make a genuine success of the ranch along the creek. Sallie would write her column for the Gazette for 15 more years and develop a readership across 6 counties, and eventually be asked to compile the columns into a book, which Daniel Reeves at the Gazette helped her arrange to print, and which sold with a modesty entirely appropriate to a book about kitchen gardens, but which she was prouder of than any other thing she had made with her hands. Thomas Fletcher would grow into a quiet and thoughtful young man who went to school in Austin and came back with a law degree and set up a practice in Crestfall, and was, by general agreement, excellent at his work. June Fletcher would grow into a loud and passionate and brilliantly argumentative young woman, who was her mother exactly and her father exactly and herself entirely, and who would leave for San Francisco at the age of 22 to work as a journalist and send home letters that were the most entertaining pieces of writing her parents had ever read. And Gilbert and Sallie would be there through all of it, in the house along the creek with the kitchen garden along the south wall and the room full of books, arguing about literature in the evenings, and sitting on the porch in the summer mornings, and growing old in each other's company with the ease and comfort of two people who had found, in each other, the specific and irreplaceable thing they had been looking for without knowing they were looking. On an afternoon in the fall of 1889, 11 years after Gilbert had ridden into Crestfall on his big roan horse, they sat on their porch as they often did in the evenings, and the cottonwoods were turning gold along the creek and the air had that clean, cold edge of October, and Gilbert was reading and Sallie was reading, and they had been sitting in companionable silence for a good 30 minutes, which was one of the things she loved best about him, that they could do this. Sit together without needing to fill the silence. He looked up from his book and looked at her and said, quite suddenly, "Do you know what I thought the first morning we talked, behind Hattie's boarding house?" "Up. You told me you thought there it is." "Before that," he said, "in the actual moment before the thinking, there was a second, just a second, where I thought, here is a woman who is exactly and completely herself, and I had not seen that in a very long time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did that feel like?" "Like the moment when you crest a hill on the trail and the country opens up in front of you and you realize it is more beautiful than you expected," he said. "A kind of sudden, involuntary gladness." She looked at him across the porch in the October light, this man with his gray-green eyes and his books and his grandmother's ghost in her pepper garden and his early morning coffee and his steady, thorough, loving attention, and she said, "That is an exceptionally good description." "I have been practicing it for 11 years, he said. She laughed, and he smiled when she laughed, the same way he had smiled the first morning, as if her laugh was something he was glad to have caused, and the creek ran through the cottonwoods with its old reliable sound, and the garden was putting itself to bed for the winter, and the house behind them was full of the evidence of a life being lived fully and without apology, and Sallie Doyle, who had been invisible to every man in town for the better part of a decade, sat on her own porch in the warm October lastlight and felt, as she did every day, thoroughly and completely and entirely seen.